in California, in Northern California, and sleeping in a tent, and it was fall and cold. And I thought, he needs something warm. I'll take a quilt class. So I took a quilt class and made a little quilt like this. And then I thought, okay, I know everything I need to know to make a quilt. Well, I did not. So by hook and crook, I finished that quilt doing all the wrong things, but it is the favorite quilt for the family, just because it's warm and fuzzy and squishy, and they all love to wrap up in it. So even if you do it wrong, it will be the best quilt you ever made for your family. But so what I've done in the past, whether it was pottery or stained glass or woodworking, kind of carries forward to what I'm doing in fiber work. Not necessarily in the same way, but I love texture because of some of that. I love color because of some of that. I've learned how to put things together because of that, which is why quilting made sense to me, unlike clothing did not. But I had to be aware of making all the things that I looped around interlock. Because if they don't interlock, it just falls apart on the floor when you wash out the stabilizer. So this was done with a zigzag stitch, free motion, which means that the feed dogs were down and I was guiding the fabric underneath the needle. And I cut out leaves from batik fabrics, stitched them together in between with the threads, and then did additional free motion couching on the top of it. And I have a machine that counts stitches. However, I didn't remember to count stitches from the beginning, and by the time I started couching, started remembering to look at the stitch count, I, at the end of it, had 43,000 stitches, and I was about halfway through when I started counting. So there's a lot of stitches in that. But it was fun. I will do it again, but not anytime soon. Since I have background in wood and weaving and other things, a friend of ours who's in a group who used to be in Surface Design, Cheryl Danielson, I know some of you know her, she taught us a little technique on pin weaving, just on a little piece of foam core board, and she bought beautiful fibers, and she taught us how to pin weave. So I took it home and thought, oh, I think I'll put some copper in it, because I don't necessarily always use traditional materials in what I do. I love fiber and I love fabric, but I also love metals and wood and other things. And oftentimes in my pottery, you would find fibers on it, and on some of my fabric work, you'll find pottery shards. So I think everything can live together just fine. So I revealed I had not ever dyed any fabric, and this is a piece that I did this past year at Lakeland at the Sewing Expo. How many of you have ever been to the Sewing Expo? Okay, so you know what that is, and they have all kinds of classes there. So this is a class I took with someone from Colorado who was there to teach. It's called shibori. Have any of you ever heard of shibori before? Shibori is the way that you fold fabric, you bind it, or you put resist over it, you dye it, you unbundle it and go, wow, where did that come from? Because it doesn't any way, shape, or form resemble what you thought you were going to get it, especially when you do ice dyeing, and this one was ice dyed. So when you ice dye, even if you have tied or bound or resisted in a way that you kind of know what's going to happen and that you could reproduce, sort of, mostly, if you put ice on it and then apply the dye trickles here, there, and everywhere. You don't know what it's going to interact with or where it's going to land on your fabric, and so it's a total surprise. This one was a 6-point fold, and you can kind of see you fold it this way, the fabric, then you folded it this way, then you folded it on angles, flip it and fold it on the other angles, so that you end up with something that looks a little bit like this. And this one is not the same kind of shibori, but you end up with a little triangular handkerchief looking thing. And so that whatever you do to resist the dye, wherever it is, whether it was done with rubber bands like this was, or whether you've done it with other kinds of templates that resist the dye, that keep the dye from going to the fabric, if you have it resisted here, it's going to have the same resist pattern all the way through. And so when you open it up, you end up with a symmetrical circular design. So this was a different kind of shibori technique, but it was folded the same way this one was. So shibori is a lot of fun, and Mei Ling is she's the queen of shibori, as you'll see.
Thank you for giving it.
Like this one was done in 2013, and sometimes when I make a piece, it's because I want to explore something. Other times it's because this was the Hoffman Challenge. Hoffman is a fabric company, and they have a challenge every year, and they give you a piece of fabric that you need to work with, or they specify a fabric that has to be seen prominently in the quilt. And it can be any theme you want it to be, but that fabric has to be used and be recognized. So this is the fabric. And on the back, you'll see the fabric. So some of the things in that, this fabric hung up in my studio, in my sewing space for a good 2 months, and I thought of fish, and I thought of flowers, and I thought of all kinds of things, but I didn't really want it didn't really grab me. And then I thought, oh, that looks like a snake skin. I go, I don't want to do a snake. It could be a lizard. Oh, I want to be a lizard. And then I go, a dragon is a lizard, and what's my favorite lizard? A dragon. And that harks back to my career as a children's librarian, where a lot of the dragons in the literature of young adult and children's literature are friendly dragons. And they act like people and interact with people. They may breathe fire, but they get along with the person they really like. So this one is kind of a self-portrait, but it's really kind of... If I want to see, I have to have these, unless it's out of this one. So, but this is called the quilter because it is a portrait of a quilter. It represents all the materials that a quilter will use. It's called Stash Queen because a dragon has a stash, his hoard or her hoard of treasure, and so does a quilter, and it's called a stash. The treasure hoard is stash. And it's fabric, it's buttons, it's beads, it's fibers. But it's collaged together. I do like to collage fabrics. Sometimes the collage is done by putting a fusible, a fusible on the back of it. When you press it and iron it with heat, it makes your fabric stick down. Other times I just use a glue stick and put it in place and it's just stitched down. But I have a lot of fun solving problems on this one and using unusual materials like for the glasses and actually using real embellishments on it. So that one was done for the Hoffman Challenge. It did win a second place in applique that year. So and then this one was the first. And this one was the first time I had dyed a piece of fabric with the intent of doing something with it. And Angie Knowles in our guild. Among others, they were teaching a couple of years ago, they were teaching us how to dye and how to do surface design techniques. And so Angie gave us this long piece of fabric and she told us how to dye it and manipulate it to get the background colors. And then I did a little discharge with bleach, which is how some of these snowflakes come about. The longer you leave the bleach on there, the more color comes out of the fabric, and so you get various levels of color gradations. And then it was stenciled, and this is an original silkscreen design, and others were stencils that were commercial stencils. And this reminds, I love birds flying in the sunset, and this one reminds me of Ida and where we lived, and with birds in the sunset. And this one, again, piece. So it didn't turn out to be tropical colors, is what I expected. It turned out to look cold, so it became a winter piece. This one was because my quilt guild has a challenge every other year. And the year that we had this challenge, it was telling tales, that quilts tell tales, and they do. There's stories behind quilts, whether it's a story. Hey, Angie. I just talked about you. This is Angie. But this one, I didn't know what kind of story it was really going to tell until I started working with it. And this one was done, it's the first time I'd ever used digital apps for designing something that I actually then followed through with, other than just having the picture on my phone by the thousands. So this one started with this little motif here that was a total circle. And it was this little black and white one. And what I did after that was, it was done in a symmetry app called Doodle Dandy. That's just a little kid's simple app. And when you do a symmetry app, and what happens is, like if you do this motion in one place on your screen, the symmetry app makes that motion and that shape immediately all the way around. So that's the way this quilt started. And I thought, well, I wonder what I can do with that by taking it from that app and then putting in some other apps just to see how it might change that. And when I did this, it wasn't because I was doing it for the challenge, it was just because I was doing it. I was playing. So eventually, after this little motif went through several different apps, it turned into a grid. And this is I'll show you what the grid looks like. I'll give that to you, Ms. Beth, because I don't make that anymore. This was a grid that I thought, well, that I really like for a quilt. Maybe I'll do that, but how am I going to turn it into a quilt? Because my printer only prints 8.5 by 11.
How about if I hold the
Yeah, thanks. And so this was what happened. It was a process of printing out the grid, which that was the first printout of it. And then I thought, I don't really like how regular that is. Maybe I'll shift things around a little bit. And so then I thought, but still, how the heck am I going to turn that into a quilt that needs to be bigger than this? So I have an app. If you have an iPad or an iPhone, this app will work on yours. It's called Print to Size. And when you use that, you can conveniently, this picture could be divided into almost a 4-patch, like these 4 parts of the grid, 9 times. So I could print it 9 separate times if I could enlarge it, but the question was how to enlarge it. So I found this app called Print to Size that let me do that, and voila, it will enlarge it to whatever size you want on your paper. So I simply divided that into 9 sections, and then after it was printed, I put it together in a big cartoon, one big thing. And I thought, I don't really like the way they look together, so I shuffled them around and changed the way it looked. And I wanted to get color in it, so I used Inktense pencils to add color. And the dimension comes from a technique in quilting called trapunto, where you, on these were just, okay, this is shibori, but it's folded a different way. It's a flat fold, folded into long rectangles, and then rubber bands were put around it, not like this, but by pleating along the areas. Actually, I think I will show you the picture. You end up with a piece of, this was a yard of fabric that was folded like that, sort of long, and then you have big fat rubber bands, and after you bound them, I had about, I had a lot of pieces. It was put on the tray for dyeing, and ice was put over it, and then dye was squirted over it, and you can kind of see in this picture that the dye pattern, but again, when it trickled through the ice, it all melted together and did different things. So when I opened it up, I had no idea what was coming out. This is the way it looked when it was bound. And this is what came out. So I wanted to quilt it very simply because I didn't want to mess with the pattern. I liked it the way it was. It reminded me of fireworks. So I called it Fire and Ice, since I used ice dyeing to make it, and quilted it with a special sewing machine that I have that makes it look like it's hand quilted. It skips a stitch. It's called a sashiko machine. This was the first quilt that I did after I learned to quilt and how to make a block by piecing it together. I really don't like piecing that much. But one of the members of our guild is named Marlene Glickman, and some of you know Marlene. But a couple of us in our guild went to Marlene's house. I'd never even imagined that you would do this on a quilt. But she had a stencil of a leaf, and she had some masking tape. So with the stencil of the leaf and the masking tape and Lumiere paint, I just had a black piece of fabric and painted on it and stenciled on it, and got home and go, oh, what now? Had a lot of fun, but what to do? But this color of the paint reminded me of copper, and I had a lot of copper wire, and some fairly thin copper sheets, so I cut them and sewed them down or couched them down and layered pieces of fabric. So this is my first, I called it quilting outside my box, because it's the first time I really didn't do a traditional quilt. So, and then I liked not doing traditional things, and so this started with leftovers of various projects. Some had been needle felted. I added fibers to it that were those stretchy things you get at Joann's, and some other threads, and cut it apart and just tried some hand stitching and made it asymmetrical instead of just square, and used my serger on parts of it. Just played around, and that was the result here. I like it because of the textures and the colors, and I had fun doing it. I learned everything I do, I learned something that helps me get a different idea. This one was a challenge again from my guild, and it was called you were supposed to express what you were passionate about. And I've always loved sun faces. When I did pottery, I did a lot of faces that were like the stylized sun faces. So this one reminded me of the sun face. I collaged and trapped the fabrics underneath netting, and then tore away the netting in the places out in the background, and quilted it with my sashiko machine. That's the first time I used that. So this one was a result of a class that I took with Bonnie Bowman at Dunedin Fine Arts. It's the art cloth class that she teaches. And I made all the fabrics, didn't physically make the fabric. I made all the patterns on the fabrics in Bonnie's class. This was silkscreen and stenciled. These were with monoprinting. This was a discharge piece. And this is the only commercial fabric in there, was for that piping. So that was a fun quilt to make because it brought everything that I learned in Bonnie's class together. And then this was just using, again, playing with those little decorative fabrics you get from the books. And I liked the textures of them. It reminded me of fall. I made copper leaves, made some copper beads and embellishments. Played with paint, and painted the back of it after it was quilted. Now you get to see how the hanging system works.
Yeah. I noticed that.
This one, my husband had just bought some threads that he thought I would like, and he had also just purchased a die that was a leaf die from an AccuCut machine. And if you roll the fabric through, you cut a shape that's pre-designed on fabric. So I had been looking at some quilts by Libby Lehman, who was a well-known quilter, and she liked to do thread transparencies, where if you stitch a lot of thread over a color, but you don't totally cover up the fabric, it changes the background color, and that's what's happening here. The red threads, this was a black and dark brown fabric to start with for the background, and the threads are what are making those color changes. And it was the first time I had ever tried to do anything with trapunto as well. So, and again, I wasn't planning on making a quilt. I was just playing. And I thought, oh, I kind of like that. And I spent a lot of time doing all that stitching. I need to make it into a quilt, but I had no fabric left. So I learned how to add fabric to a pre-existing quilt and made it bigger, and that's how that quilt came about. And then this one was one of the...
That's your big leaf.
Oh, my big leaf. Okay. Your leaf. Yeah, my leaf. Okay. This again was the result of a guild challenge. And in this one, what was the challenge? I don't remember what the challenge was. the challenge was, can't read upside down. Anyway, it was to, I think it was, we had to use this fabric. That was the challenge fabric. That was a requirement to use. And so I like fall, I like leaves. I'm really fascinated with how leaves decay and the different transformations they go through from the time they're just a bud and to the time they fall and after they fall. So I saw a leaf on the sidewalk and picked it up and was studying it, and I thought, I've got a piece of hand-dyed fabric that I would really love to make a large leaf on, and I wanted to see if I could make it dimensional, really dimensional, not just with stitching. So I cut my leaf, I quilted it, I wired it, I couched the wires in, I added feather fabrics to make it look as if it were decaying, and then had to use this fabric. So this was like a cobblestone, just a rock path of some sort and dirt. But I wanted to burn and melt fabric to see what would happen if you burned and melt. Susan Lentz does a lot of that. So I have layers of cheesecloth. I have a batik in the middle. I have a different kind of polyester on the back that melts and regresses when you heat it. So, and this is very crisp and stiff. It breaks thread like crazy. It was not fun to quilt on after I melted it and burned it. But it's one of my favorite quilts. I really like the dimension. I love the leaf part. I like what I learned about this, and I wish the back was on the front. But it's not. It is not ever going to be. Despite what Mayling says I should do. This one was a class that I took with Rob Appel, who was one of the reasons I started quilting, because before I retired from my career as a librarian, I was sitting eating breakfast and watching PBS. And so whatever I was watching was done, but the next program that came on was Alex Anderson's Simply Quilts, and I'd never seen that before because I did not like to sew. And I always turned it off. But that day, I forgot to turn the TV off, and she had Rob Appel on, and he brought a quilt that he had created from a photograph. The challenge was given to 5 quilters with the same photograph. They had to interpret that. So he showed an oceanscape, which was the subject of the picture, boulders and water out in the Pacific. And I thought, oh my gosh, that's a painting. You don't sleep under that. It's the first time I saw the concept of a quilt that you could hang on the wall. And so I thought, maybe quilting will go on my retirement list. And it did. It just didn't happen. I really thought that when I retired I would be a potter, and that's what my intent was, but that didn't happen, so I became a quilter instead. But this one, a lot of people think that this was a pre-printed fabric and that's it. I just stitched it, but it's not. This sky was one piece of fabric that was a hand-dyed. This piece of fabric that starts here and goes to the bottom was another hand-dyed. Now, here's where fussy cutting comes in. These turtles are all cut very fussily around their exact print on the fabric and cut out. And I cut a whole bunch of turtles out. I cut a whole bunch of fish out. I cut out these trees. And then I thought, I don't have enough stuff. So I started looking at my fabric stash and going, oh, this reminds me, this was cut out. This was actually printed on some fabric. As a coral. So, as was this, but these kinds of fabrics were not. They were just fabrics that I thought would work for corals or sea fans or whatever. And so I collaged this again. This one was done with a fusible. I collaged it, and the view from here is sky, surface water, and underwater. And we used to do turtle watch in Fort Myers, so that's why I picked the turtles. And then, of course, now the lionfish, which is an invasive species, is a big concern in our Gulf because they're endangering the whole habitat. But when I quilted this, and when you When you stitch a quilt after it has its batting in, that's why it's called quilting. That's your quilting stitch, and it creates dimension and texture. But the thing with turtles is they always come back to the same shore, year after year, decade after decade. And for hundreds of years they've been doing this. So in my quilting, I quilted outlines of 5 turtles.
Ancestors, right.
Somewhere in this, not up here, but down in this area, from this side to this side, there are 5 turtles quilted in here in various sizes, and they represent the past and future generations of the quilts that have, of the turtles that have come and that will continue to come, we hope. So,
You?
thanks. If anybody has any questions, otherwise,